So thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I'm sorry that I can't be there, mostly because you guys have great weather, but because it would be great to get on an airplane and go someplace. I've been holed up for a long time, like everybody else, but super holed up. I have autoimmune issues, so I've been super shielded for
Oh,
since March. So here I am. I get to see people and I get to see you. Um, so I want to talk about keeping digital products safe. As folks have already mentioned, I'm a management consultant, so I'm probably really different than a lot of you in the room. I think the best street cred that I have is that I'm around you all the time. When I do the work of digital governance, and I'll talk a little bit about what that is as we push into the presentation, I'm around you and I see you. So I think of myself as an advocate for makers, an advocate for technologists. So I'm going to say this a million times over the course of this 40, 45-minute talk, which is this is not about bashing people for making things that aren't absolutely perfect. Sometimes it seems like this problem that we have online and all the churn and crazy that's happening and the impact of these new technologies that we've been using for the last 20, 25 years is that it's so big that we can't really do anything about it. So my goal is to really talk about the problem of what's happening online, talk about how we get into environments that are unsafe in general, and then apply that to digital, define digital safety, and then towards the end, just talk some about what it means to keep things safe and about doing work where you are. So if there's anything, I'm going to say it at the end, if there's anything that I really want everyone to hear in this conversation is that, you can't boil the ocean, but everyone can do something to keep things safer where they are in the present moment right now. So that's what I'm going to talk about. There's a lot of rich conversations going about ethics and a lot of political conversations. I hear them and I honor them, but I really, really like this frame of safety because I think it objectifies it a little bit, makes it a little bit dispassionate, and it's actually a problem that you can work. So that's where I'm going to be for most of the time. And I'm looking forward to any questions, criticisms, anything that you have to say about that. And mostly, I hope that you just get some value out of this. So I'm going to tell you a couple stories just because I really like stories. I'm writing a murder mystery set in Silicon Valley right now, which is really fun. It's like this kind of runs into like, who would you not want to kill? But anyhow, there's a lot of fun things around that. But anyhow, so I really like stories a lot. So here, this is the story of, unfortunately, story of Mary Ward. So in 1869, Mary Ward was an Irish naturalist and an author, and she's riding in with her family, her cousins, in this steam-powered automobile. It was a prototype automobile. And she's thrown from the vehicle as it's going around the bend. Unfortunately, she falls into the path of the vehicle, her neck's broken, and she dies instantly. And so the reason why I'm bringing out this story is not to be gory, but it was the first recorded automobile fatality, right? So obviously for us right now, sitting where we are in 2020, that sort of 3-point seatbelt, like the kind invented by Niels Bohlin from Volvo in the 1950s, and that patent was sort of donated to industry, that would have saved her life. And it really seems like those types of safety innovations that immediately would have been on the heels of all the tragedies that started to happen. 100 years of hindsight make seatbelts seem completely obvious, and it also seems sensible that we would implement safety measures. But that's not really what happened, right? So what happened is that there was this long-winded, almost 100-year or over 100-year process where we had to go from the first gasoline-powered car. The one that she was in was just steam-powered, right? The first gasoline-powered car in 1875. And there's this sort of range of innovation around safety features. So they invented crumple zones and softer interiors, this whole set of features that they did all the way up into the anthropomorphic test devices that we use now. And even past 1971, even more recently, they've started to be more inclusive about anthropomorphic test devices, which were generally just like 6-foot 6-foot tall bodies with flat chests and broad shoulders, right? And so now they've got ones for dogs and they want ones for babies and all this. So this is this constant process of innovation. So if you look at the timeline of when these things were actually invented, and then you start to bring in some other aspects of when they actually were standardized and became mandatory. And if you look at a lot of other technological paths, telecommunications, whatever the case may be in innovation, there's this path. Somebody invents something, crazy train. Bad stuff happens because that's what happens when you innovate. You don't really know what's going to happen. People start inventing safety things around it, and then industry says, we can't do that because you're going to stifle innovation, or we can't do that because it's too expensive. Customers say, I don't want to use that. That's too controlling. People, I saw an email, I own a Volvo. And by accident today, I got an email from Volvo because there was some recall. That's the other thing, recalls, safety recalls, that said, did you know that when we invented, I thought it was like serendipitous because I was giving this talk and mentioning this guy. When we invented the 3-point, seat belt, people thought that it was like a violation of their personal rights to be restrained in that way, right? And so stuff that we really take for granted and just sort of slide on, it really takes a while to ingest that. And what always gets it done, and I know it's unfortunate, is just legislation and regulation, right? So you can see that line when the UN says this in 1958, and the US, and I'm being very US centered in this talk, in 1966, and then people are like, okay, if you're going to make us do it, we're going to do it. These things are going to be mandatory. So that's kind of the path of how things happened. So the history of automotive product technology, it just took this sort of meandering path, and it took this 100 years of doing it. So safety is a process, right? And safety is never a destination. It will never be all right, but we have to start somewhere, right? And so if you think hard about these early innovation cycles, as well, you can't govern and control something that doesn't exist. So early on, when you're creating new technologies or conceiving of new ideas, there's really nothing to write safety standards for. You have to get to this point of, this is a thing, and then you put it out there. And of course, people who make things think they know how the thing works because they made it. But the reality is technologies always surprise us. They always do things that we had never had any idea that they could do. And I think we're seeing that a lot online right now. So that's one story. So let's go to another story. This picture might be more familiar to people, although some of you might have been Mary Ward fans. She was actually a kind of hop-in lady. She was really into microscopes, and I'm wondering, she's riding around in this prototype steam-powered thing in 1869. That's kind of badass. But anyhow, May 7th, 2016, Joshua Brown, entrepreneur, he's riding around in his Tesla Model S. Right, he's got the autopilot functionality engaged, and that functionality didn't recognize a tractor trailer that pulled into his path. I think many of us who has followed this know this story. Car goes under the tractor trailer, goes through a fence, hits a power pole, and he dies instantly at the scene. So this is the first fatality that has to do with an automobile with autopilot engaged. And again, people were horrified. I'm horrified. I feel emotional now even talking about this. This was a human being with a family and loved ones, and he looks super modern, and he's standing by in his car and he's super happy. It's a really sad thing. But again, there was no general public concern saying, Tesla, stop until this is absolutely safe, right? We're willing to take a certain amount of risk when it comes to innovation. And so innovation, not to sound heartless, does involve a certain level of risk. But so, why am I talking about this if I'm just saying it's all going to be, risky? I think that at a certain point, when you have a product or service that's in place and you're getting ready to scale it, you really can stop and consider and take a safety assessment and at least understand the risks involved and the risks that are inherent in the work that you're doing. And I think if there's a criticism of digital, it's that we don't do that. We don't do that enough in this space. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'll talk about that a lot as we move on. So digital safety is just a really interesting topic to me. I used to talk a lot about digital governance, and I still talk a lot about digital governance, but people don't like that word as much. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a history of me, not because I'm ego-centered, but because the path that I took to get to this point of talking about safety is not interesting as in interesting, I'm an interesting person. It's just, I think it's relevant. How about that? It's relevant. So I was an undergrad philosophy major, and I was not the philosophy major that got to wear the beret and smoke the cigarettes and think about my feelings in all my fields. I thought that's what I was going to get, but I ended up at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, not Chapel Hill. It's a very small department, and there are professors who were super into symbolic logic. So you're talking to a woman who had hated math. I know I'm not with my people right here, but I really hated math. I was not bad at it, but I really didn't like it. I ended up in this department where I just had to take like a whole bunch of symbolic logic. And so that was great. It made me not hate math. And I ended up writing my senior thesis with a professor who was really into artificial intelligence on Keith Gunderson's mentality in machines. And so that was all accidental. I was not really into it. I started out a music major, but I ended up in this kind of weird thing. So as a result of those skills, I actually can code. The only thing that I can code is Prolog, right? So that's it, because its relationship to symbolic logic. That was a natural fit for me. So that's not maybe the most practical thing, but that's me just trying to spread out some of my geek credentials. So I thought I wanted to be a philosophy professor. I went to Columbia University as a philosophy fellow for a year. I knew almost instantly it was a mistake. So I spent a lot of time at the Metropolitan Opera listening to opera. And I also spent a lot of time emailing my beau, who was a computer science master's degree candidate someplace else. And that was my first exposure to the internet, using Pine to send email to my boyfriend. So I wish I had a better story, a more exciting story about a technology adoption in Lisa, but this is really a stumbling path. So I left grad school. I had a Mac that I had bought for grad school, and I started playing around with HyperCard. Right, so this was my first experience with anything hypertexty in the language. What I also ended up doing was, because I had these computer skills and I was in New York City and I could write really well and I was reasonably smart, I started temping. And at that time, temping from an admin capacity meant, word processing. So WordStar, where you have to actually tag words. And so I would get these really super high level temp jobs at these global multinational corporations, where they'd put me in when, the CEO's secretary went on a holiday or on maternity leave, they'd slot me in. So why am I telling you this? One, because I got this tremendous exposure to executives, right? I started to see how people very senior in very large organizations act, what they know, what they don't know, how they're catered to and how they're not catered to, where their strengths and weaknesses are. Also, in that whole time, I also got exposed to early collaboration software like Lotus Notes. And so I did early Lotus Notes development. So I ended up getting married. I got pregnant and was home on maternity leave, and I was bored. And a friend of mine who lived in Silicon Valley, this is 1995, bought me a 9600 baud modem and an HTML book as a maternity gift because I was bored. So I taught myself hypertext markup language, packed my bags, moved to Silicon Valley, and ended up, after coding pages for Netscape, which was kind of fun, ended up at Cisco Systems. Now, this job was the absolute gift and the direct connection to what I do now. So much as when I had been in New York and I'd seen large corporations and how they function and what happens at the executive level, I also was inside Cisco Systems right when the commercial web was hitting. They had a huge website. They were doing multi-channel delivery. They were doing usability studies, sophisticated things with metadata management, a lot of things that some companies really have difficulty doing right now. But it also showed me something else about people. And if you haven't noticed a theme about this, is I love technology, but I love more the people who make technology. I'm very, very interested in what people do with the technology and how they make it as a part of the team. And so what I noticed, that even though Cisco Systems understood the internet and the web, because they would, given what they do, they had a horrible time managing their online properties, right? They thought about them, they couldn't get any consistency. So that made me understand that just because you can build something or make something or understand it does not mean that you know how to manage it well, right? And so I think that, which seems like a very, very simplistic thing, is something that's really obvious that's happening right now in our digital spaces. Just because you can make something doesn't necessarily mean that you can manage it well or that you can manage the outcome of it consistently. So I quit Cisco in 1999. I've been consulting, and the culmination of that has been that I'm working to put words around digital governance, which is really about establishing a vocabulary and framework for putting into place good decision-making mechanisms around rules. So an easy thing would be, a taxonomy. That's a set of rules. And, visual design components are rules. There are deeper things in the technology stack. Usually when there are governance problems that manifest as a discordant online presence or an unsafe online presence, there's usually not a consistent set of rules that are happening and being consistently applied and used inside the organization. And so I go in and help them do that. I help them organize that. And it really is more psychology than it is anything else. It's about control and power, and who inside the organization thinks that they ought to be able to make those rules. There's two different types of organizations that I tend to work with in this capacity, and they're very different, and I think might be resonant for some of you all who are working on new technologies. One are companies that existed prior to the advent of the commercial web, and then, which I call transforming, and then companies that existed after. So natives, digitally native companies, they have different types of problems. Transforming companies have a difficulty ingesting digital, and because it displaces certain activities internally and their power structures that it messes with. But they oftentimes accept the concept of governance and know that there need to be rules and know that they need to manage things effectively. So their challenge is getting away from the way things used to be and ingesting the new technologies and understanding how to capitalize on them and use them. For digitally native companies, it's the other side. They know how to use these technologies. They're all about technologies, but they don't know how to run a company, right? And not knowing how to run a company in a large digital environment means that you really don't know what's going on, and you don't have checks and balances in place to ensure that what you're building is being built with intent. It's just basically like growth gone wild, right? And so they're immature as a business. So there are two different types of challenges. And so I've been doing digital governance for a while, and after a while, people are kind of like, she's the party pooper. People who work in an agile environment are like, you just want us to stop and make a bunch of rules and do stuff. And I was like, no, I don't. I want you to have a framework through which you make things, and you can do that fast or slow. That's entirely up to you. But I was also realizing that there were some people that I'm working with that did have rules. They did have a governing framework put in place, but what they were making was still not great. Like, they're on the list of bad digital people, right? And so it's like, okay, so they are governing, but the substance of what they're doing isn't great. And that's when I really started to think there's this other component that marries with governance, which is around ethics, the morality of what you make, the culture of the business that you're working in, and the context of the society in which the products and services that you create are deployed. And so that's when I thought, it's safety. People really want to feel safe online, right? So I think that, no matter what kind of good or bad experience that you have online, or what your opinion is about what's online, there are pornographic sites online, and there are sites for children. Both of those extreme cases of things have safety measures in place, for the user. So people want to interact in their experience in online by their choice, and wherever they want to feel safe. They don't want to be traumatized. They want to feel like they're in control. And I think not feeling that is a lot of what's going on right now. So I've teamed with Andy Vitale, who's a user experience expert and designer, because that's not my competency, to try and talk about designing for safety, right? And what would it look like to take safety into consideration as you're designing and building. So that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this time, of just kind of like talking about how products become safe, defining digital safety, and giving you some tips on how to improve safety as things move forward. So I'm a kind of a basics person, right? And Christina mentioned, like, I'm always noticing, things that people aren't noticing. It's not that I'm particularly bright. It's that I think I'm smart enough, but so I'm not dismissing myself. It's just that I often go back to the fundamentals. I think the fundamentals are really important. And oftentimes when there's an error, the error is in the fundamental. It's not in some complicated thing. So let's talk about these two terms, digital and safety. And so digital is really interesting. When I work with folks, one of the first things I say to them, so it's digital governance that I'm usually working with them on, or now talking about digital safety for them. It's like, what do you mean when you say digital? And they're like, well, it really depends, right? So if I'm working with an automobile manufacturer, it's anything from their marketing website that talks about their business and has their press releases, all the way through their marketing collateral materials, all the way through the car configurator and all of the data and information that goes into that. Then that tucks into some supply chain related things in the back end, all the way to, okay, autonomous driving. So they have a very broad arcing thing that's all about digital for them. If I'm talking to my local restaurant, last night I went and got Indian food. She's complaining because the prices aren't right on the menu, on the online menu. So it can be very small case or not. But then there are these other two things that are obviously related to digital spaces, which are the web and the internet, right? So they're all interrelated, but I think it's just really important to get that the web is a container that holds all the stuff we build and put online. So if the web isn't safe, it's not safe because what we're building and putting online isn't safe, which means maybe if what we build and put online is safer and better, that quality will go up. So there's also internet governance and safety related issues that are about feeds and speeds, net neutrality. There's all these sets of things that are interrelated to one another. And I see them and I honor them and I hear them. WWW is all about standards. I'll talk about that a little bit later on, of just sort of like a lot of what's really helpful about the web early on was that we had the W3C and this set of standards that's just sort of sitting right there. So there are rules around these technologies. So just for the purposes of this talk, I'm not talking about the W3C and the governance of the World Wide Web, and I'm not talking about ISOC governance of the internet. I'm not talking about the fact that the UN says that access to the internet is a human right. I'm not saying they're not important. I'm saying at this moment, I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is what businesses and people build and put online, right? So when I say digital, that is what I am talking about, without a doubt. So that's my thing for digital. Now, safety is more interesting. When I originally was thinking about this idea and started talking about it with Andy, the first thing that I went into my mind was consumer products. Let's just treat safety let's just treat the web like a consumer product, right? We have all these safety standards, and I got a recall for my Volvo. When bad things happen, there are mechanisms. We know how to keep things safe. And the web's interesting because it is this combination of like stuff and transactions and activities that happen online, as well as stuff that's FCC related, right? So there really are no controls in the consumer product area governmentally for controlling what happens online. It all happens on the FCC. So I think, an area of research for me over the next year will be to try and tease that part and to understand what is the very nature of a digital product and service, and is the digital functionality that is, for instance, I'm not diabetic, but I have food sensitivities. And so I have a continuous glucose blood monitor in my arm, right? So I could pick my phone up if it were here and tap my arm and find out what my blood sugar is. So, and then that information goes online. So what's that, right? Is that a consumer product or is that digital or whatever? So these kind of creepy, weird in-between spaces are things that are worth talking about. But for the sake of having a definition, and for having a high level one, this is the one that we came up with, which is this idea of minimizing emotional, economic, physical, and psychological harm to any human being and to society, right? And so it's intentionally vague. Probably any type of harm that you can think about should fit underneath there. I'm curious if you can think of things that don't fit underneath there. To me, inclusion points to any human being. There are, online suicides that are happening. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that's happening online. I think there's two sets of responsibilities that are neglected in the digital space. One is that product owners need to actually understand the level of safety of the products and services they create and put online, right? And I don't believe that that's happening in a good way. I think people make things and they put them on the line online and they wait for them to break. And then, the collateral damage is on the general public and on users. And I will say that in innovation and technology, that happens, right? But we're at a point now where we know enough where we can actually start mitigating that. The second half of it is I think that consumers, people who use the product and services, have a responsibility, the equivalent with fastening your seatbelt. You can put a 3-point seatbelt in my car, but I have to fasten it, right? So it's a partnership that society has around doing these things. I think so that's my definition of safety. I think that there people have agency. There's different types of folks with agency in this system. It's a broad group. Innovators. So these are people who are the instigators and advocates of new ideas, probably many of you, right? It could be a person with a smart algorithm. It could be a person with a title like founder, CEO, product owner, product manager, angel investor, venture capitalist. These are people feeding that pipeline of innovation that keeps things moving along so well. The next ones are makers. We always focus on them. They could be architects, engineers, front end, back end, data architects, quantum computing people. I mean, it's just a broad sense of people who are actually making and building the things that we put online. This skill set is super rich, and we tend to be focused on them. And there's a lot of makers who end up being innovators. They're innovative maker founders, and that's a challenge. The next set of folks that I like to talk about are rule makers. True and due to my heart, rule makers, governance, policies and standards bearers, it's broad, right? So it's not just policies and standards bearers for a particular product in a particular business. It's also the government, right? Industry-wide standards, things that pull globally, W3C, ISOC, right? I mentioned the thing about the UN, access to the internet. So there's all kinds of rule makers that are also in this system, and they have a role to play. And so there are facilitators and bridges. These are in some ways my favorites because they're kind of elusive. They're about delivery and accountability. So in the context of building a product or service, that might be a scrum master or a project manager or an analyst who's actually feeding that mechanism. But outside of that, it's industry experts and watchdogs. It could be marketers pumping up and facilitating the use of technologies inside of that. And so these are people who are somebody says, here's a spec for RSS, but how does it get spread out and used across the board so that we actually can normalize certain behaviors? So it's a super, super important role, and I don't think identified closely enough all the time. And then last but not least, there's the rest of us, the people who use these online products and services. So every one of these groups of people have a role to play in safety. I think it's important to call out these people individually, or these groups of people individually, because a lot of times, the arguments that make me so frustrated online now is, something crazy happens online. Pick a day, any day, something crazy is going to happen online. And somebody points a finger and says, you can fix it. And it's like, these are systemic problems. That's why I said at the top of it, yes, there are people who hold a tremendous amount of control over things that happen online. I am not letting those people off the hook, but there's a whole set of people who actually feed and support that mechanism. And so I'm not giving up. Anyone where they are can do something, even if it's just a consumer deciding to actually read the frickin' privacy policy or reconfigure, the permissions on some of their social media accounts instead of just letting them be whatever the defaults are. So now we're going to talk about how safety issues arise. And so I alluded to this a little bit when we were talking about Mary Ward and Joshua earlier and their tragic accidents. But I think, I watched a couple of the talks just getting ready for this, just to kind of warm myself up. And there was the interesting one about Sisyphus. And I was like, oh, I think they're going to actually say the same thing I said, sort of. And it sort of was. But there's this path that happens all the time, over and over again, when you have a new technology. It's a very simple path. So the first thing you have is this innovation. So this is this eureka experience of an idea, of something that we can do, something that we can build, something that we can have. While that's happening, there's this organic growth. I mean, it happened with the telephone. During the organic growth, people tried different ways to do it. So steam powered, electric, gas powered engines for automobiles. Same thing with the telephone. There were a million different telephones before they finally got to something where they're like, this thing works. So I want to point out that while you're arcing up to figuring out stuff, that's where you get those, crazy pictures of the Wright brothers crashing airplanes into barns, right? It's dangerous. It is dangerous, sticky work, which is why not everyone's a bleeding edge adopter, right? I like to fly, but I wouldn't have gotten on an early airplane. I know I wouldn't have done that, right? So, but there comes this point where you've actually got something viable, repeatable, that you think you can scale into an actual product. And at that point, you need to start thinking about making it safe, right? You need to start thinking about making rules for it. Now, here's the thing. You maybe, and I'll get killed for this by someone, but you maybe don't need to make it safe, but you at least need to assess the safety of it, right? You need to understand what it can and cannot do. I think there are definitely some bottom line must-haves when it comes to keeping things safe, but I think making something absolutely safe oftentimes stifles it. I'm not talking about inclusion, which I think is a basic. I'm not talking about a lot of basic human things that haven't happened in digital spaces, but I'm just saying there's probably going to be some room in there for there to be some safety issues that are known that don't get mitigated early, and they'll work out over time. Now, what happens if you don't do that is you fall into this sort of chaotic pit of nonsense, and that's a large opportunity for harm and risk, right? So you've got a product, you've decided that it works, you're going to scale it, you're going to bring it to a large group of people, you offer it out, you haven't checked whether or not it's safe, people get on it, and you're basically like alpha testing on them, right? And I know other people have said that as well, but that's a huge safety risk for people. So people go crazy. I think that's where we are now. Oh my God, it's completely unsafe. This is crazy. It's your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. There's many debates and arguments over time. And then we climb through this process, right? People go, we ought to have some rules. It's like, okay, we ought to have some rules. Well, what should the rules be? We argue about that for a while. We drive to rules. Eventually, we get to a basic set of rules or standards about what you shouldn't do around the safety of the product and service. And then it continues. Then you have this glorious spot where the thing's safe and profitable. Everybody can fly on an airplane or cars. You know, like just safety is an issue with cars, but most of them are pretty safe, right? There's variability. There's just, people just aren't even thinking about it. Now, the challenge with that is that things get commoditized and they start to level out, and then it's like price, like what's the cheapest version? They're kind of all the same. It's like the way phone systems were before we started doing voice over IP. You know, you order a phone system for your office and it was like color, how many lines do you want, and price. They all basically did the same thing, right? And so those things weren't differentiators. So when you get to that point, that's an opportunity for something to swoop in and completely disrupt that business model, which is why businesses that can cycle through that safe and profitable thing and ride over an innovation into a new wave are very rare, right? It's very rare for businesses to do that. They either reinvent themselves, go out of business, or acquire to sustain that level. So growth, I thought I took this actual slide out, but anyhow, this is my favorite DNA slide because when I timed it, I didn't have time. But this is my favorite DNA slide where I like to talk about growth and a blueprint for a set of rules. And I'm making a very simple point here, which is that things do not scale with integrity without a blueprint, right? It just doesn't work. And I'm sure you guys who are super smart are going to come up with an example that works. I'm not saying that it can't scale, but with integrity. So, you know, for people, it's DNA. If you look through nature, you'll find all kinds of things. For industry, it's robotics and replication and assembly lines. So there's just this systematized pattern where things happen. And the reason why I brought this up in the first place is I often don't think there's anything new under the sun, right? Because everyone always likes to say digital, it's completely new. And it's like, no, it's not. You know, we had document management before, we had data flow before, we had all these other things before. And so I'm definitely a mismatcher in NLP language. If somebody says something, I'm going to say no. But in this case, I was actually searching for what is the kind of interesting, unique thing about digital and this growth. And I think one of the unique things about it is that usually on this end, there's a few people using the product. And then when you get to some fairly decent governance and some fairly decent rules and some fairly decent set, that's when you get into this commoditized everything. It doesn't wait till the very end, but there's just this surge that happens. But because if you remember the slide when I was talking about the internet and the World Wide Web, those are two super standardized technologies, like under the water iceberg technologies that support digital spaces. So you've got the internet starting in the 1950s or something like that. And Tim Berners-Lee paper on the World Wide Web was in the late 80s. He wrote that paper at CERN. I should probably know that or write it in my notes. But in any case, they were there, and the W3C was in place with web standards. So what happened was that. So we had this switch where the commercial web turned on, like in the early mid 90s, and people jumped on it and it ramped really hard because it was already standardized. That's unusual in a technology innovation environment from just the sort of things that I've been reading. And so that's a unique thing about digital. And I think it validates everyone's intuition, which was there was incredible amount of fast growth, but that fast growth doesn't mean maturity. But I think we kind of duped ourselves into thinking maybe that fast growth that we were in a more mature place than we actually are. And I think we're finding out that we're not. So last thing to finish up really in just exploring this idea is, what can we do now? These are sort of gentle things that really focus on, depending on who you are in that community of agents that I mentioned earlier. I think that the first thing to do is really understand where we are in the context of this. And I'm going to make a couple of statements and a couple of predictions. One of them is, it's still early, and it's hard sometimes for human beings to understand that the path of innovation and growth spans over in a span that's greater than their lifetime. So I hear people saying, I've had the web my whole life, or for me, I've been doing this for 25, 30 years. It doesn't matter, right? Innovation curves don't care how long the span of a human life is. It has nothing to do with you or I being able to see the end of the story for this. So the other thing is that digital's foundational technologies, the internet and the web, are still poorly and inconsistently governed, right? So the World Wide Web is significant. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee is kicking as hard as he can in the pool with the World Wide Web Foundation to try and pull this thing together. You know, he sort of unleashed this beast onto the world, and it's just gone crazy. And so that's as it should be in some ways, just the craziness of it and him trying to leash it back in. But, you know, there are parts of the world where access to the internet is variable. There's parts of the world where full access to the web is variable. We haven't come to an agreement, even in an individual country, about how things ought to operate. When it comes to data privacy and security, there's GDPR, and then there's the way that we're doing it here in the US. And then there's the way you're doing it in California, which is hard to enforce, by the way, in terms of, you know, just how these data protection privacies work. So we don't have an idea of how the rules should be. So we're working in an immature environment. So these are the two predictions that I have around here, which is that dot that said governance, we're probably still 25 to 30 years away from it. 25 to 30 years away from saying, here's a good set of rules about how we should operate online, both nationally and globally, right? Or maybe, you know, interstellarly, who knows? The Martians might come while we're working out and solve the problem for us. That would give us something else to pay attention to. So those types of governance and rules and safety rules that come into place will really happen incrementally and by intentional design, and there will be additional tragedy, right? That is, I can't think of a technology where that hasn't happened. And I'm not wishing it through, but I think it's good to go in wide-eyed about how these things happen and what can happen in this type of environment. And then I think it's going to be at least 50 years until we get to the point of car-like safety. I don't think, not a lot of people, although, you know, it was interesting. I was in Senegal a couple of years ago, just on a holiday, and, you know, the car's got no windows, the gear shift barely works. And this one taxi cab that I was in, the guy literally got in, what do you call the thing that you tighten the lug nuts with? In the car, whatever that thing is, he would get out every couple kilometers and tighten the wheel, right? So it was just, you know, those things are all relative. You know, safety is relative. So it's never going to be like just this span out thing. I bet that car was safe once, but it wasn't safe anymore. So those things are really contextual, but I think we're really far out. So what that means is, you know, we don't have to wait for that. I think we're all part of that process, and all of those safety agents have a role to play. And so I'd really just in the last few minutes like to talk about what role each of those groups of people that I mentioned earlier can play right now to raise their level of awareness around safety. And so for technology innovators, they have to take ownership for the safety of the products and services that they fund, build, and release, right? You can't punt that stuff out into the field and expect somebody else to deal with it. You need to be responsible for it. So leading is more than just thinking of new ways to exploit technology. It's about creating a safe environment for the employees that work, allowing them to talk about safety, and to bring those things up, and promoting a culture of safety, establishing guiding principles that reflect the ethical framework of your company. Now, I might not choose as a consumer to use your product because I don't like your ethical framework, but you should at least have one, right? And that is the responsibility of innovators. And I think for the most part, they tend to fail in this space. They're still acting like it was 20 years ago and that you can sort of fly by your seat of your pants and not be responsible. I think it's starting to shift, but I don't think it's shifting hard enough. I think for people who actually build and make products, they need to realize and honor the truth that upstream safety is better than downstream. Anything upstream is better than downstream. Engineering safety into a product is easier than fixing a product that's broken and causing tragedy. I think we're seeing a lot of that right now with a lot of the big social software companies just having to fix stuff. Their whole business model is floating on top of this thing that doesn't really work, but they can't and won't unplug it because they're going to unplug the company. So engineering safety in from the top. Safety assessment should be part of the conception, prototyping, and build process. Should constantly be checking for safety, constantly understanding what could potentially go wrong. And you should not bring things to scale that you don't know are not safe, or that you don't understand the safety of, or that you understand the safety of and you haven't communicated that safety to the consumer. One of the interesting exceptions to the Consumer Protection Safety Act was firearms. And I was like, yeah, well, of course, we know that those aren't safe, right? And so, but people choose to use them anyway. I think what's going on in digital spaces is that makers aren't really thinking about that. And so they're not giving consumers the opportunity to understand whether or not something's safe or not safe because they're not articulating it. I think rule makers need to really broaden their perspective beyond sort of the functional product integrity and profit and regulation, right? So I wrote a piece a few years back called "Does it delight? Does it parse? Does it pay?" Right? And so basically, if consumers love it and they're buying it and the code works, then we're cool. So I think rule makers need to broaden that and start to bring in some of the ethical, emotional, and social considerations and impact of the software when they're actually building rules around that. And those rules needs to happen at the product level, and it needs to happen at the national level, and it needs to happen at the international level. What rules do we need to put in place in order for things to be safe? I think for facilitators and bridges, they have to actively promote and maintain a culture of safety. I think this is the richest place right now. There are a lot of facilitators and bridges in organizations like ISOC, the W3C, the Web Foundation, and just a long list in academia. We're actually starting to have these conversations about safety and whether or not how things could be safe in a digital space and why they should be safe in a digital space. So I think just considering that and talking more about safety as a concept across vertical market spaces and across geographies is going to be super important. And that work is being done right now, can continue to be done. And I think for the last piece for consumers is, they and we just have a responsibility to investigate the safety of the digital products that we use. And we're going to have to fasten our digital seatbelts because it's going to be a bumpy ride. I think that maturity curve that I showed you is an inevitable thing. I think awareness of the maturity curve and awareness of how we move through these phases of safety and governance, moving from innovation to commodity, understanding how that works is really important. Will maybe help us move a little bit faster, but there's a lot of people on the planet. That's a lot of organizing. I mean, for those of you who've worked inside large organizations or even in an academic environment, it's hard to organize people and get them to do the same thing. So it's just going to take a while for that to happen, even with the best of intentions. So I hope that was kind of like a good sort of exploration. I'm curious about ideas that you might have. It's sort of just a framework to think about, and hopefully can inform you in the work that you're doing and will make you a little bit more thoughtful about how you can maybe integrate safety in some of the work that you're doing, or at least in the thought or in the community of people that you work with. A couple last points. Safety must be fought for with intent. I'm a big proponent of intentionality. You have to mean it. You have to want it. Work where you are. You don't have to go out and have a whole protest sign. You don't have to tweet to everybody, but that thing that you're working on right now, that idea that you're building right now, think about safety in that context and be brave. I think there are a lot of people in the digital space who lack managerial courage. They won't make the hard decisions. and they don't want to stick out as being the one who's kind of rocking the boat. And I think that can oftentimes be very, very challenging. So I think being brave is super important. And I'll support you if you need somebody in your corner. Not that that's much of anything, but I think there's a lot of me's out in the world. And a lot of times all we need is one person to sort of step out and make a statement, and other people will follow. So please be brave at all possible. And bring it on. Always bring your big self and your best self. And I hope that was really a helpful conversation.
Thank you very much. We are, so the inaudible claps are happening. And we are transitioning to conversation, Q&A. If you're willing to stop sharing your screen so everyone can see you full screen, that would be amazing. Thank you. So panelists, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions, or to simply just raise your hand in the interface. Students, I linked to hci.st/QA if you'd like to submit something. It's just behind a Stanford login wall to deal with Zoom bombing. I'll kick it off with one question while folks are getting ready. So I think that this question of how we govern ourselves, I agree. There's been a lot, and I've myself made errors in like waiting too long to figure some of this stuff out, and it's come back to really haunt the effort. And I guess what I have a really pragmatic question, which is that when is too early and when is too late? So like clearly, if I guess there are some cases where you're trying to imagine harms and you want to do that, say, very much up front. But if we're thinking specifically about governance, there are points at which we don't know what we're doing yet. And then there are points where it's too late because we should have figured it out earlier. So do you have any rules of thumb you give about when sort of the Goldilocks?
Well, I think the way that you're talking about the problem is not the way that I would think about the problem, which is that what you're saying sounds like if you know that there's a problem, you should fix it, right? And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you should know that there's a problem and understand the risk involved in proceeding with that in place. Tesla is a really great example. There's this big announcement today. They're putting all this autopilot software into their cars and rolling it out or whatever. And I know it's been 3-4 years since the accident that I mentioned, but we know that something not good is not going to happen, right? At some point with that, because it's a new technology. And I'm not saying I'm not bashing. It's just inevitable. So I think just being clear-eyed about that doesn't mean you don't proceed, but I bet you they know where the vulnerabilities are. And that's my criticism, is that people proceed without evaluating the vulnerabilities, right? So I think, particularly with some of in the .com spaces, the wide access that allowed all this spoofing and bots or whatever, it just didn't have to happen that way, right? That wasn't complicated, right? You could have thought of a use case of abuse very early on and at least known it, been looking for it, and then when it started to ramp up, mitigated immediately. So you can have a safety plan in your back pocket and go, okay, we're going to implement and see what happens. We know this bad thing can happen and we're ready for it, right? And so I think that's what's not happening, that component. And I honestly think it's because you have people in there who are passionate about the technology, right? And good-hearted, or that's on the good side, good-hearted is on the good side, or just lack awareness. Like they're sociologically narrow, like, algorithm bias. I can't freaking get through an airport on that face recognition SPID. I mean, I travel the world and it's difficult for me to get through. Somebody just wasn't thinking. Do I aggressively think they were trying to attack people of color by doing that? No, but what a narrow existence that wasn't even a consideration. So I think having that inclusion and thinking about those things early will keep bad stuff from being engineered in. And so am I answering your question? Like, I don't think there's a Goldilocks moment. I think it's part of the system and it's a part of checks and balances. You do the same thing with the technology. This
Sure.
works good enough, right? Doesn't work exactly how we want it, but it works good enough that we can try it out, right?
I think what I'm in some sense trying to drive at is that there are definitely there's a totally reasonable position that says safety first, before you
Yep.
make any decisions about anything,
Yep.
you should have a safety audit about the ideas that you're pursuing, who it's going to harm and how, like before you even decide to go for it. And then there's some people who are going to say, well, you should wait a little bit until you've like decided that this is a direction you want to go, to which the response is, well, at that point you've made the decision and you've made the decision to harm people. So I guess what I'm trying to get a sense of is, are you going to sort of fall on the side of people who say, no, like you need to put safety into, when we teach design, right? Do we do need finding, and is safety part of the need finding process? Is it part of the ideation process? Does it come after ideation but before prototyping? Like how should we concretely weave this in?
I think you're right that I'm going to fall on what you're presenting as the more conservative side or the safer side, but not for everything. Right. So, I mean, all things aren't equal. Like there's no reason for, facial recognition technology not to be inclusive out of the gate. Right. But there's some other stuff that maybe could drive a little crazy for a while, right? Because it's not as systemically damaging. So I think there's subtlety to it. It's not like, check this box. I mean, that's what I think makes it so difficult. The breadth of what is happening online is so staggering. I mean, there's nanotechnologies in people's body that are connected to, I mean, it's completely insane. So the level of safety and care for the thing stuck in my arm really better be higher than, for some other things that are happening in the digital space. And I think what's happening is innovators and early founders and makers don't have that holistic sense of looking at stuff. It's like this sort of hyper focus, which is required to get it done, which is why that community of people of founding and creating and conceiving of things probably needs to be more inclusive, right? Not to stop it, but just to broaden the perspective.
Yeah, as my own closing comment here, and then we'll open it to anyone else who has comments. I was on a panel a couple of days ago where a comment was made that I thought was really incisive, which was that if you want to look to the sort of future harms that are going to happen through a system, all you really need to do is go look at the harms that are currently affecting marginalized groups, and you're there.
I mean, people ask me all the time, like, they call me governance girl for like the last 20 years. It's supposed to be, I almost got a cape, and a whip, but it was just, it was ridiculous. People would make fun of me at these events. And they're like, oh, you're always looking into the wrong side of thing. And it's like, I grew up upper middle class. I'm fine financially. I'm not your Black American who grew up in financially disadvantaged circumstances, but I am underneath this brown skin and I've operated in it as well from a social perspective. Stuff can go wrong and bad things can go can happen. And I know that. And the fact that I know that means that I'm a little bit more tuned into risk. Like the world is not a magic carpet ride for me. I know things can go bad. So I'm more inclined to go, okay, what could potentially go bad than maybe somebody who grew up in an environment or lives in a world that sort of wraps them up a little bit more safely and carries them through things. And so that's, maybe a little bit of a political thing to say, but I think it's important. And so that's why inclusion is important in these environments.
Hi, thank you very much for laying out the framework and what all needs to be done and all the different people that need to do it. I wonder if you could tell a story about some time when you helped a company or a piece of technology or whatever work their way towards finding their 3-point seatbelt.
Wow. So I don't do safety for a living. I do governance for a living, but I can say that and the majority of my work has been helping large global multinational corporations or people in like the NGO community, like the UN, govern digital. So write rules for digital. And so to a certain extent, some of those rules are about, keeping things safe. So that's just my full disclosure. But I think probably one of my most interesting stories in this space has to do with one of your neighbors down there, which is Intel. Right. So I worked with Intel, and it was great because they called me and they already had a digital governance, fairly senior person working in that space. And we were actually effectively able to get people globally and locally aligned around following a same set of rules. Now, in their case, it was not about safety. I'll be completely honest. It was really about saving money in their marketing spaces, being more impactful from a sales environment. But but they were very, very effective in it. They were data driven. What I learned in that project, honestly, was how much the culture of the organization and the people involved impacted their ability to actually create a rule set. So we're inside an organization that makes a zero defect product. The project was half done, right, already. So it was just like, when you say there are rules and you must follow them. I got to talk to the person who was in charge of supply chain management and talk about how they got diverse constituents to align around a set of rules, right? So I'm not directly answering your question because, to be honest with you, I'm still exploring the ideas of safety and trying to define the ideas of safety around this. And my hope is that got my plan with a couple of different places to actually be sitting and doing some research around this and to do some test cases and use cases, right, around with some large organizations. I've consulted for a long time, so I have a lot of relationships, and that's good because I really want to prove the point. I want to learn more about risk and mitigation and safety plans in manufacturing, right? So there's all these sorts of things. People already know how to be safe, right? There's already processes for being safe and plans for being safe. So I want to learn how to take those plans and apply those rules in a business context, which is why I'm working on the book. So you're asking me a question, ask me in like 3 years.
So thanks, very stimulating talk. Hello, Lisa. So my question stems from thinking that the legal system,
yes,
and potential lawsuits create disincentives for finding risks and dangers in the technology that you're creating. Because if in discovery it's found out that you knew about a potential problem, right, then your liability is actually increased. So it's the argument that it's better to just kind of put your head in the sand. What do you think?
So yes, and I would argue yes. I spend a lot of time talking with attorneys, as you could well imagine. And the biggest weakness in them, honestly, is I don't think, depending on where you are, if you're inside of a transforming company that's not particularly digitally centered, or that has a business model that hasn't been, but they're moving into it, like pharma is an example, or different aspects of healthcare, they're starting to create these wearables and that sort of thing. A lot of times the internal mechanism isn't mature enough to actually surface that. Like, they don't understand the risk, right? So I think that's a challenge. And I know that's not the question that you're asking me, but I wanted to point that out, that so I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I honestly think it's just a messy process we're going to have to get through. So yes, some people might get in trouble and sued because they knew that there was a problem with the way that they were distributing something online or interacting online, or permissions or privacy, or how they were handling their data, and they'll get sued out of business. That's going to happen, but it's not going to be everybody. And people will learn from that particular case. I sort of sound like a horrible hard ass, but they'll learn from that case and things will improve. But that's the process of climbing up that hill to like standardize, normalize behavior. And so to the extent, I think that might have a little bit to do with the culture of the business. How transparent do you want to be? How much does society value that transparency? Am I going to be afraid to use something? If nothing's safe, am I going to use the product that says they're not safe, or am I going to use the one that doesn't say anything? That depends on whether or not I know it's safe or not. So I think we're just in this kind of mismatch of stuff. But I argue some from research and some from intuition. I won't pretend that my research has been as rigorous as it will be 2 years from now, but that we're going to get there and we're going to push through to the other side. And yes, I agree. It is a disincentive to surface those types of things, but I don't really think that's what's going on. I think they don't know. I think they just they're not paying attention. That's my experience. You go in, you say stuff, and they're like, oh, wow, I hadn't thought of that. Like just some of the smartest people in the world, they just hadn't put their mind to it. And so my argument is put your mind to it earlier. And I think that's the advantage. If you put your mind to it earlier, then you can mitigate that through architectural concerns and also just through communications. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, partly. I mean, do you think there are legal or policy reforms that could address this?
That's a good question. Yes, I do think so, but I think we'll end up in that particular argument of like, how open and free do we want to allow these technologies to be versus safety. So I think we're gonna get a little bit of both. The interesting aspect to what you're asking that's kind of making me tilt my head and be silent is the global nature of the internet and web, right? So if you ask me about that in the US, the very capitalist-centered US, I would say, yeah, there's a certain set of legislation that might be put in place that can leave things more open or free organizations from litigation, or have them be less at risk for litigation based on the types of behaviors that you were deciding. But it's not that, it's global, right? And so I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure how that might work out at a global level, if that makes sense. That's something to think about.